I thought it was a really good album. In retrospect, I probably don't think it's as good now as I thought then. Probably not as good as the two albums that went before it, really.
I wish I could say that Maladjusted is a great record, because I like to buck trends, I like to be different, and I'd like to say Maladjusted is the great lost Morrissey masterpiece, and the cloth-eared critics yet again have got him wrong. But it's not. It's really not very good, Maladjusted. In fact, it's bordering on being rubbish. And the fear, the chill wind of fear, greets you as soon as you see the sleeve, where he looks like he's dressed for creosoting the fence on a Sunday afternoon. This is a man who used to fling gladioli around in his Comme des Garçons chemises and his National Health glasses. You know, he was an icon, a left field icon, but an icon nonetheless. He's got a sort of V-neck jumper on and some kind of ordinary jeans that you might pick up at a garden centre, perhaps for £4.99. And he's kind of squatting and he looks really awkward. He looks like an ordinary boy, which maybe that was the idea, but that is not Morrissey's forte.
Well, there are lots of reasons why Maladjusted was almost the end of Morrissey as an artist. The first is that it came after a very difficult album, which was Southpaw Grammar. Actually, Maladjusted is a better album than Southpaw Grammar, in my opinion, but it needed to be a lot better. The other reason, which is probably more important, is that Morrissey was at the absolute nadir of his fashionability, or at the peak of his unfashionability, depending on your point of view. And, you know, Britpop was at its height, and nobody wanted to talk about Morrissey.
It's got Steve Lillywhite. I mean, he should be okay, but I think the trouble is, by now, the world has grown used to Morrissey, and Morrissey has grown used to himself. And it was just time to go away. It seemed to me by now Morrissey was on a conveyor belt of making records, and it was time for a new Morrissey record. It had a title that sounded good for a Morrissey record, Maladjusted. It's not great, it just sounds Morrissey-esque. And a whole host of songs that just have evaporated from my mind. I mean, I would very rarely would go and play that record. It's not an absolute clunker, I don't think. It's just a very boring Morrissey record. And if your love affair with Morrissey is as intense as those of us who've always loved him, you just don't want boring records. And I think the time was right for him to sort of swing that black cape around his face and disappear into the mist for a while. But the story, of course, was to be continued.
The failure of Maladjusted put Morrissey's career into crisis. Both the public and the critics had begun to overlook a singer who had once been so pivotal to British music. And Morrissey was dismissed as a faded talent, a spent force from a bygone era.
What originally became fashionable about the fact that he wasn't fashionable then did begin in the way that things are treated to look old-fashioned. So he looked old-fashioned. And it was very easy to turn your back on an old hero in order to celebrate even more the new heroes that seemed to be doing what Morrissey had done, but better. It made it better. It made it more likely that you would have so much love for your Radioheads and your Blurs and your Oasis or whatever. Therefore, you didn't have time for Morrissey and whatever Morrissey had set up to, in a way, create the climate for those groups to exist.
He was deeply unfashionable in the 90s, in the mid to late 90s, partly because he had to be assassinated in order for the 90s to happen. He was this ultimate pop star, the ultimate fan that turned ultimate pop star, and it's an impossible act to follow. So that's why he had to be got rid of.
In a move that surprised many of his fans, Morrissey left the country and relocated to Los Angeles. England had lost its strangest son, and Morrissey had left behind the home that had been his inspiration, the small cold island that he had loved and hated in equal measure. In Los Angeles, he planned to disappear. Yet it was a far more successful vanishing act than he could have wished for. Within a year, Morrissey was without a record contract, And although he toured in 1999 and 2000, his fall from grace bewildered both the music press and his fans.
Where is he? He's gone to live in Los Angeles. There's this guy we thought was iconic of Britain. Apparently he's living in Los Angeles. He hadn't got a record deal. This on a daily basis used to, you know, make some of us shake our heads with disbelief. All right, Maladjusted was not a great record. But when you listened in the late 1990s to some of the absolute rubbish that the record companies were putting out, every week you'd be sent the next big thing, and you'd listen to this garbage, these dullards, these barnyard twerps, and think, Morrissey can't get a deal, and these people can. Particularly coincided with the pop idol phenomenon in Britain and the USA. And you'd think, these no-marks can put out records, and Morrissey's not got a deal. Even if you didn't like Morrissey, even if you got bored with him, even if you'd never liked him, I think you felt like British music and British pop culture in general, and American culture, had lost this rather flamboyant, interesting, always entertaining figure. And I think everyone breathed a sigh of relief when he came back. I mean, he toured twice, I think, without a record deal, which compounded the irony and bizarreness of it all. We felt he's back in circulation. Apparently he's living next door to Nancy Sinatra, and he's hanging out with Latino street gangs in LA. It all seemed a bit mad, but luckily it all kind of came good in the end.
Following his 2002 tour, in which he played new material for the first time since Maladjusted, Morrissey was finally rescued from obscurity by the aptly titled Sanctuary Records. The time was right for a triumphant return.
Now Britpop is dead and buried. The 90s, everyone wants to forget about it until, you know, 10 years' time, 10, 15 years' time, everyone will want to recycle it. But for now, it's over, and Morrissey's back.
In 2004, the questions over Morrissey's significance to modern music were finally answered. With Blink 182 producer Jerry Finn behind the desk, the defiant Englishman returned from the wilderness with new material to unleash on a public fed up with pretenders to the throne. His first single, Irish Blood, English Heart, saw him catapulted into the British charts at number 2, the most successful chart placing of his career.
When I first heard Irish Blood, English Heart, I thought, great. There was a kind of sigh of relief, because it rocks. And I think that's what had been lacking on Maladjusted and the latter Morrissey records. There'd been a rather fey sort of Morrissey-esque stuff. But the Smiths, as well as being beautiful, could rock. And it rocked. And he had a kind of swagger about it. And when he came back, he looked different. He was older. And I think he looked different in a good way. That rather skinny youth with the quiff had been replaced by what he is, a stocky, handsome man in his mid-40s. But he looked like he'd grown into his skin a bit as well, and I thought that was a perfect record to put out. It was a real defiant sense of, this is me, this is the stock I come from, of Irish, English, Northern stock. And it felt passionate. He seemed a bit angry. It had a bit of a swagger to it. He came back looking like he was spotting for a fight, willing to take on all comers, like the champ getting back in the ring. And I think people felt like that about it.
You Are the Quarry confirmed that Morrissey was back on form. Ecstatically received on its release in May 2004, it was seen by many as his strongest album since the widely applauded Vauxhall and I.
You Are the Quarry is a very, very